Hello minders, welcome back to another Mind Shot vlog. I'm going to talk a little more about acrylics today. I really had no idea there was so much interest in that. I mean, that episode really kind of blew up, and I had several questions, several comments, several requests to do a demo. Now again, my channel is on watercolor, and it's gonna be. I'm gonna focus on. I may bring these things in once in a while, but I'm not going to go down that road, so to speak. But I will do a very quick demo today, and possibly in the future, you know, we'll do some multimedia kind of inclusions of acrylic. Just keep in mind one thing though. Almost all of the techniques that I've taught and mentioned over all the episodes and over the the 2.5 years that I've been doing this are going to apply to acrylic as well. So what I'm teaching with watercolor you can do with acrylic, with the exception of lifting. You can't with lifting, but acrylics, they glaze beautifully, they wet and wet beautifully. You might see differences in flow, but you do in watercolor too. You see differences among brands, you see differences among colors. So I'm just going to mention to you a few things and show you a wet and wet demo, and just talk about a couple things that you'll come across with acrylics. Then hang on after that, because then I'm going to show you a couple of alternatives to yellow ochre. I had a comment about yellow ochre that they felt like it was an essential color, and I should have mentioned that. Sorry to disagree, but it is not an essential color, and I'm going to show you, if you decide not to use yellow ochre, which I'm fine if you do, by the way, I don't care if you use yellow ochre, but if you decide not to use yellow ochre because it's giving you muddiness problems, I'll show you some alternatives. Alright, so I'm just going to wet this whole board down real good, soaking wet, and just do a little wet and wet demo here and talk about acrylics. Now first of all, this is acrylic over here. This is golden, and I like, for watercolor purposes, I like to use a very liquid acrylic because it's more concentrated usually. Although you could probably thin out a heavy body acrylic as well and get decent results. First of all, I recommend you work like this. Do not work on your watercolor palette, as I mentioned in the last video. Work on either an acrylic palette that you've already designated for acrylic, or just get a throwaway palette like this paper plate. And we'll start with Core. Now Core has a very lively movement because they use a different binder than some of the other watercolors. You can see it spidering out there. That's one of the neat things about Core. You like that lively movement in paint, and it does of course depend on hue to a degree. I'm just going to get some really heavy vibrant paint going on here. Alright, now, and I am using a synthetic brush, an inexpensive synthetic brush. I was asked that question to clarify, and yes, I believe you should segregate your brushes. I would not use good watercolor brushes with acrylic. It's pretty much the same. And as long as it's wet, hasn't dried, I'm going to rinse out my brush. You can go in and you can lift. You can do some lifting. There will be some paper staining, just as there is with watercolor. I mean, you're just talking about a pigment, just like watercolor. Only a different vehicle, different binder. Let's grab a spray bottle, see what happens. If you're wanting to make it run, get that paper really wet, more or less identical kind of a treatment. I can even dab some acrylic over there and dab some watercolor over here. Not much point in doing that, but the main thing I'll stress is I would treat it as though you are painting with acrylic. Keep your palette segregated, keep your brushes segregated for acrylic use. And while I'm doing it this time, if you're going to do a lot of this, you can't see it, it's out of camera, but I would even get a different water bucket if you're going to do a lot of acrylic painting. Don't use the same water bucket that you use for watercolor. The reason is because once you do a lot of watercolor painting, once you do a lot of acrylic painting, it develops film. You'll get a film inside your water bucket, and eventually that film, unless you wash it off really, really good, that film would eventually peel and kind of granulate, and it'll mix in with your water. I had a water container that I did a lot of acrylic painting. I've done a lot of acrylics over the years. It just got a very thin coating over time that eventually just kind of dusted off and mixed in with my water. I finally had to toss it out. You obviously don't want to get that kind of film on your watercolor bucket. So very little difference here. Once you let it dry, you can go in and glaze with other colors. Now let's deal with the adhesion or the binding question. I had several people comment that highly thinned out acrylics have a binding problem, and that's true with canvas or non-absorbent surfaces. You don't have a problem with absorbent watercolor paper like this. It soaks into the paper catches and holds the pigment, and you don't have to worry. Now where you might have to worry is as you go back, and this is still wet, but let's imagine it's dry. As you go back in and glaze, and you do another layer, and then maybe you go back and you glaze another layer over that, eventually the acrylic pigments in the binder are going to fill up and saturate that paper, and then you're going to end up with sort of a plasticky acrylic-like surface. You're essentially putting an acrylic finish on your paper. Now, it takes a while to do that, but eventually your absorption is going to cut down if you've added a lot of layers, and you're going to end up with a non-absorbent surface if you've done tons of layers. Okay, so just a few things to keep in mind. And I stress again, all of the tutorials I have done on watercolor, with the exception of lifting, can apply to acrylics. You can use masking fluid. You can scratch. The only thing you need to keep in mind are your tools and how you might be affecting your tools. Acrylics tends to be hard on brushes, and if you leave any residue in there and it dries, it's going to be permanent. Alright, let's go on to my second topic. Now, in the video I did on muddy colors, I mentioned some colors that you might want to watch out for if you're having trouble with muddiness. They were not colors that I said you shouldn't use. They were just colors that can be a problem if you're not careful. One of those colors was this one. This is Yellow Ochre. I'm taking this off my Mission Gold palette because that's one of the few places I have it. Beautiful yellow ochre. And I love the color. Now, I made the comment that I just don't use it. First of all, that's a personal choice. That's just something I decided to do. I definitely am not saying you should not use yellow ochre. So if you're going to use yellow ochre, if it's opaque, just watch it. If not, if it's a transparent version, fine. Just use it to your heart's content. Now, if you want a color for color matchup, this is the one I would recommend. This is transparent yellow oxide. Now, this is sort of browner than this yellow ochre. There actually are several yellow ochres out there. There are redder versions that would match this exactly, but this is yellow iron oxide, transparent yellow oxide, excuse me. And that's off of my core palette. M. Graham also makes it. Now, off of my M. Graham palette, I like Nickel Azo Yellow, which you'll immediately see is yellower and more intense, more golden, with just a touch of red iron oxide mixed in, possibly some purple. A lot of great ochre-like shades out of that. And you can bend it one way or another depending on what you do. You can make it look more raw sienna-ish if you put the red iron oxide in there. But that's a very, very transparent. This is very transparent. This is very transparent. And there are tons. I mean, there are tons of mixes that'll give you close to an ochre-like color. You don't have to use ochre right out of the bottle. Bottom line is, folks, use what you love what you use. Understand what you use and how it affects your painting. Simple as that. Thanks. I hope these clarifications and examples were help to you, and we'll see you in the next video.